Okay, over to you, Carol. The recording has been kicked off.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to host this session with a very big question, which is how large companies are already taking steps to be sustainable in their software. And I'm even more delighted because we have great participants, great panelists for this session. So I'm very happy to welcome Emmanuel Laroche, who is Sustainable IT Manager at Airbus, but also who is Vice Director of Communication for the French National Institute for Sustainable IT. So hello, bonjour, Emmanuel. Thank you so much for being there.
Good morning.
Then I'm welcoming as well Margaret Ann Splone from Microsoft, and you are a sustainability industry advocate. What a great role. And you'll have to tell us more about that. Hello, good morning, Margaret.
Thank you.
And Florian de Kerchove, welcome as well. You are from Agoria, the Business Federation for Digital Companies in Belgium, and you are Senior Advisor for Digital. Very happy to host you, to have you also in the session. Thank you for
Thank
being
you as
there.
well.
So, the idea of this session is basically to have a discussion on this question. We all know all the sustainability urgencies, whether it's environmental, social, and ethical topics we're talking about. Now, what we'd like to know is, in our large companies, what we can see as steps already taken so that it can, serve as examples, or, and let's also deep dive on potentially the obstacles that you have seen, you have been able to reduce or remove in your companies. And what I think is great is the three of you, you have both a view internally of what's happening in your own organization, but also you are in contact with many other large companies, whether it's Emmanuel with the INR, the Institute of Sustainable IT, whether it's Agoria, you Florian, and of course, Margaret with the Microsoft clients. So I will go through the first question, which is, we are very well aware on one side that technology has negative impact. It creates greenhouse gas emissions, it creates pollutions, it consumes some resources and water. So how, Emmanuel, I'll start with you. What actions are already taken at Airbus to master this negative impact throughout the software lifecycle?
Well, thank you, Carol. The first thing is really to consider the life cycle of the digital services. So we are talking about the development, of course. So we are really at the beginning of the life cycle, but I would say that we should start by the end. So we should anticipate the end of life of any digital service to be able to enable the decommissioning and to say, well, we know that we are going to develop because there is a need, but how do we get sure that the need is still there in 2 years, 3 years? So how do we anticipate the end of life and the decommissioning? The second thing is to simplify the architecture, especially in aeronautics. We have very complex IT architectures, and our architects have worked on a technical complexity index that is a way to evaluate the level of complexity of our thousands of digital services, and it was deployed to our digital portfolio. So we should also onboard best practices to simplify this architecture. And all these best practices are part of a referential, an eco-design referential. Today, different referentials have been produced by the Institute for Sustainable IT, by the government too, with what we call the DINUM, that is the IT part of the government. And there is an AFNOR specification. So the AFNOR is the French international standard organization. It is the French part of the ISO. So we can say that we have referentials that are coming, and now we are integrating it in Airbus, and we want to be to take this referential as a part of our quality referential, so that we have to respect it when we are developing any digital service. And of course, we have to train our staff to eco-designing, to be aware of this referential and to respect these best practices. The ambition is to say we are able to perform security by design for cybersecurity. So we don't consider only the time, quality, and cost, but also the security. We want to jump to the sustainability by design in the development of the tools.
Security and sustainability by design, that's a great target. How well is this already deployed at Airbus? And because you have this role at the Sustainable IT organization in France, how do you see the interest and the deployment of these referential and practices you are mentioning in other companies, at other members of l'Institut du Numérique Responsable? What's the level of maturity?
Well, I would say that there is a very good maturity on all the services that are related to web. So websites, we have the means to measure the footprint. By example, you know that there is a site called ecometer.org that enables to evaluate the footprint of any web page. But the maturity is clearly lower on the enterprise digital tools. And in big companies, let's say that the web part is negligible. In the example of Airbus, we have 7 websites, but we have thousands of digital services. So I would say that the maturity is very different depending on the services that we are considering. And after, there are companies that are more mature also. Some companies have been working on this topic for more than 15 years. So they are very mature. And what we can mention, it's not always obvious, but when we see which economical field of the companies are very represented in the Institute for Sustainable IT, it is banks. We can explain
What do you
it.
mean by
Banks.
Banks,
Banks,
okay, sorry.
Banks, sorry. So my accent is not very good. So the banks are really represented, and we can say that it's not an hazard. It's really because it's a part of their reasons to be, and clearly it's very strategic for them to work on sustainability. Risk management, and it's also a way to give sense to some transformation programs that they have to deal with.
So different level of maturity depending on the type of digital services and depending on the industry. What about you, Margareta, in Microsoft? How do you see this idea of embedding green software and sustainability by design in the software, in the IT architecture deployed at Microsoft and at your clients?
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you for inviting me here. At Microsoft, we started our own sustainability journey. It began really when we first set our carbon goal more than a decade ago. This led us to better organize our data and realign our company's vision and strategy with our sustainability goals. In January 2020, we set ambitious goals to be carbon negative by 2030, and by 2050, we will remove our historical emissions since we were founded in 1975. We are committed to be a water positive, zero waste company by 2030 and to build a planetary computer that will aggregate environmental data from around the world. Now, regarding actions in software development, it's important to understand the two philosophies that we see of sustainable software engineering is that one, everyone has a part to play in the climate solution, and two, that sustainability is enough all by itself to justify our work. Because nothing happens in isolation, everything is connected, and small changes lead to significant changes. Even the act of normalizing a discussion about sustainability in technical meetings will empower others to raise their voice. And that's how you create change in any organization. So as you know, sustainable software engineers, we believe that everyone has a part to play in the climate solution. And sustainable software engineering is inclusive by design. So whatever sector or industry role, technology, there's always something you can do to have an impact. We recognize that there are many advantages as well to building sustainable applications. They are almost always cheaper, they are often more performant, and they are often more resilient. But the primary reason we are practicing sustainable software engineering is for sustainability, and everything else is really an added advantage. As I mentioned, we've been on the sustainability journey for over a decade. And in order to be carbon negative company by 2030, we are improving efficiency in our operations, devices, and supply chain. We are delivering technology to help our customers measure and manage their carbon emissions more effectively. And we're breaking new ground with carbon removal purchases and investments to help develop the crucial nascent carbon reduction market. And we also look to share our lessons learned. For those here who aren't familiar or don't know that much about sustainable software engineering, we've actually got a fantastic online course, and it's free. It's just 30 minutes, and it's packed with useful information on the 8 principles of sustainable software engineering. And I'll pop that in the chat. But back over to you, Carol.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I love the idea that small changes lead to significant changes, and that each of us can right away learn via the online course. You mentioned a very interesting thing, that not only we can act on, as Emmanuel was mentioning, reducing the negative impact of sustainability, but we have also solutions to help the business towards the sustainability transformation in a positive manner. So Florian, at Agoria, I think you've together, not I think, I know that together with Accenture, you've conducted a study on this topic of, comparing kind of the negative impact of technology and the positives. Can you tell us a bit about this study?
Yes, thank you, Carol, for inviting me first for this debate. So indeed, Agoria launched a study called Digital for Climate together with Accenture last year, and we just published the result last month. So it's very fresh. And the objective of the study, as you said, is really to see how digital technologies can contribute to reduce carbon emissions in Belgium. And therefore, we identified 15 applications of digital technologies that can significantly reduce carbon emissions in the 4 most carbon-intensive sectors in Belgium. And those 4 sectors are manufacturing, buildings, mobility, and energy. And so to measure the net carbon emissions, we compared this potential of those technologies with the total carbon footprint of digital by 2030.
In Belgium?
In Belgium, yes. Yeah. And this study was also conducted by Accenture in Germany or for other institutions. But here it's for Belgium. And the key result of this study is that carbon savings potential of digital technology is 5 times more important than the total carbon footprint of digital technologies by 2030. So definitely the impact is very positive. Digital technologies have a positive impact. And this carbon savings potential represents about 10% of the total Belgian carbon emissions. So it's quite significant. Now, just to give you some examples about the selected applications of digital technologies, but we have 15, but here I will give you 3. For example, the digital twin in the manufacturing industry. With the implementation of digital twin, we can reduce carbon emissions by about 10% in average. Another example is the building management system in a commercial building. And with this application of digital technologies, you can save about 30% of carbon emissions. Again, it's quite impressive. And a third example is telework. And with telework, just working like 1 or 2 days a week at home instead of at the office, you can reduce carbon emission by 16%. So again, it's quite important. And those figures and those we also conducted 20 interviews that confirm really the concrete effect of those technologies in the 4 sectors.
Great. That's impressive because it's at the same time very concrete examples in many industries, and you have actual data and measures. And actually, I want to come back to this notion of key objectives and key KPIs around green software and sustainability and technology. How do we measure progress? How can we make sure that we are, doing the right actions that have the right impact with the right level of priority? So, Emmanuel, you were mentioning at Airbus different initiatives that you've taken. How do you measure progress?
First, if we are dealing with key progress indicator, I would say that we should make the difference between maturity and performance. I will give an example to illustrate it. If the best practices is to respect ecolabels when I buy an IT devices, I can request them. I'm mature, but maybe I won't satisfy them because there are other constraints, financial constraints, etc. But I request it, I'm mature. And on the other side, I can be performant. I respect the ecolabel, but by chance. So we can be performant and not mature. We can be mature and not performant. And of course, we would like to be mature and performant. So the first KPI that I would produce would be a maturity KPI to know, to say, do I request to respect the best practices? And after, we have to measure the performance. So the performance is not only the direct impact, but also the indirect impact. To illustrate it, I will measure the energy used by our data centers, by our computers, by all our equipments, until the fixed phones, the DAP fixed phones. But I want also to be able to measure the indirect impacts relative to the services that we purchase by example. And the best example is the cloud. The goal is really to prevent from pollution transfer, but also to prevent from rebound effects. And clearly, IT is full of rebound effects. And if we want to be up to the challenge of climate change, we have to take them into account. And if we want to go further, I would say that if we want to have, let's say, a relevant measure of the environmental footprint, we should be as close as possible to a life cycle assessment, in line with the ISO 14001 standards that request to measure in life cycle assessment. And on this topic, we still have a lot to do to be able to bring the environmental footprint of any digital service. Today, we can have the big picture, but it is very different to measure it for software that we are developing. And the ambition would be to launch a PhD on this topic to make progress the research on that.
Thank you, Emmanuel. You were mentioning the rebound effect. Very often this is something left aside, but Florian, I think you have taken this into account in the study. Can you just, for sake of clarity, remind all of us what is the rebound effect and how you've taken that into account in your study?
Yeah, so the rebound effect, just to give one example, is comparison between 5G and 4G. 5G is 10 times more efficient than 4G. But of course, it produces more data. It means more data in the cloud, in data centers. So that's how we can define the rebound effect in this case. And in the study together with Accenture, indeed, we did kind of a deep dive about the rebound effect. And there are so many different studies about the rebound effect. It is extremely difficult to measure it because it's very uncertain. We don't know the future. So depending on the studies, it can go from 4% to 37% increase of use of energy. So we took the worst case, and even in the worst case, we had a multiplier effect from 2 to 3 instead of 5 in our initial study. So it means it still has a positive effect, but of course we have to work on it.
Thank you very much. And Margaret, if we keep on this topic of measuring, there are a lot of discussion on how moving to the cloud can we make sure that this has a net positive impact, and how can we measure it? Can you update us, because Microsoft is obviously a key player on the cloud transformation? Can you update us on some KPIs, on some measures that you're able to do on the Microsoft side?
Sure, and thank you, Carol. Really interesting to follow on and add to what Emmanuel and Florian were saying, because the cloud is really no longer a separate IT category. The use of cloud is growing exponentially to meet demand, and this generates a lot of interest on the one hand, just how much energy hyperscalers consume, and on the other, the carbon reduction potential of the cloud. But research, the latest research that's come out, we've commissioned papers back in 2018 and refreshed it in 2020, but there's some new research that came out from S&P in March of this year, and basically pointed to the 3 levers of savings. There's essentially 3 levers that determine the level of saving, and what they found is that 1, the equipment is more efficient, mostly because of the enhanced efficiency of processors. 2, the equipment is better utilized, and 3, there's an access to a green energy grid just brings additional benefits. And so this presents a strong underlying message in terms of cloud migration. So I can go into a bit more detail, if there's time available, but overall what this S&P research finds is that the business move, if they move their IT to cloud, enterprises can save up to 85% of energy usage, resulting in a smaller carbon footprint. And in some cases, even more of a reduction can be seen if the cloud facilities deploy completely renewable, carbon-free energy, and here organizations can improve just by moving to the cloud. At Microsoft, our goal is to be, by 2025, 100% renewable energy. And maybe let's just contrast this to when an organization houses its own IT stack. It must account for all of its energy use and therefore waste. By moving to the cloud, it's further abstracting its applications from the devices themselves, from let's say from an accounting perspective anyway, and therefore the organization is truly only responsible for the energy consumed and the emissions associated with that. It's kind of like a pay per use, but in terms of emissions. So back over to you, because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. And of course, this is great potential, and if coupled with what Emmanuel has mentioned at the beginning, like making sure we decommission what we don't need, and we have a certain kind of frugality to avoid the rebound effect that Florian was mentioning, then I think we have the right recipe. I like very much to finish this session in the 4 minutes that are left with the question from Emily Thomas, who posted the question on the chat. About the question about challenges. We can think, listening to us, I think maybe it seems like everything is magic already there, the great maturity, we have great solutions, but we know the reality is a bit different. So what challenges have you faced and that are behind you, but what are still, what are the challenges you're still struggling with in your organizations or with your clients, and how to overcome these? Anyone want to start?
Yes.
Emmanuel?
Yes, I would be pleased to start. To start with the main difficulties, the first one is a level of complexity of IT, and especially IT architectures in aeronautics. So we have to mix two levels of complexity. First, the complexity of the environmental impacts and the way we measure it. Life cycle assessment is not a simple process. And the complexity of IT, where we are sharing IT equipment. So it's quite easy to perform a life cycle assessment on IT equipment. We measure the content of gold, etc., and we have ratio to apply. But to do it on a digital service, it's more complex. We have to deal with what is the bandwidth used on the network, what are the equipment on the network, and moreover, we don't manage all the hardware relative to this service. And the second difficulty will be relative to that. On the wide area network as on the cloud, we have difficulties to get the inputs to perform a lifecycle assessment. So what are the IT architectures on the cloud? By example, what is the level of redundancy of the data? Is it duplicated twice, 3 times, or 6 times? It won't be the same footprint in any case. What is the lifetime of the hardware, the servers, the data centers, etc.? And clearly, if we increase the lifetime, we will reduce the environmental footprint, but we have to have these inputs. So there is today a lack of transparency of the inputs from some providers, some cloud providers, and also the WAN, so the network operators. And a large difficulty also is a level of competencies that is required to be able to couple the software to the hardware, to make the link, to go until the data center performance with its facilities, etc. To be transparent on the renewable energy part. When we say renewable energies, well, it's nice, but there are guarantees of origin where it is very difficult to define the carbon content of the electricity that is bought. And there are PPA, power purchase agreement, where we can find easily the carbon content. So we mix two things that are very different, and we have difficulties to get these inputs, energy, emission factors that are used, etc., to really have a footprint. So what are we have the difficulties? What are the key factors to succeed, to success? I would say the first, the training. E-learning, we have e-learning and MOOCs that are available. The Institute for Sustainable IT, if you go on the academics from EASIT, you are going to find this free MOOC and e-learnings, 30 minutes for the e-learnings, about 3 hours for the MOOC. There are other MOOCs, by example, with the INRIA and the French National Center for Scientific Research. And we have specific trainings that are very technical, relative to eco-design, relative to lifecycle assessment, applied to digital services. I would say that the climate change is the more complex and more systemic issue facing humanity. So we won't attack the Everest in tongue and in short. We have to be equipped, we have to be trained to do that. And we have also to influence our value chain to do it together, not alone. It's more complex to work to climb the Everest alone than in a full team. So we have to influence the reported data that we are requesting from our providers. We have to request also means to verify them. And we have also to define synergies with cybersecurity, by example. And by example, we were talking about a rebound effect. We have also to speak about obsolescence fighting. What do we do to have longer maintenance on our operating system, by example?
Thank you, Emmanuel. And that's really to refer to the point you mentioned on being equipped to climb the Everest. It's exactly the intent of the Green Software Foundation to bring the similar kind of elements that you've been able to put together in France with the Sustainable IT Institute at the global level, because of course our challenge is to make it to make progress at a global level. So maybe same question to you, Margaret, and on at Microsoft. What can you share as main challenges you have been facing or you're still facing, and how what's the recipe to get out of those challenges?
Well, I think this is great because it'll really segment well with what Emmanuel has just said, because in our latest sustainability report, 2021 was a year of both success and challenges. So while we continued to make progress on several of our emissions reduction goals, with an overall reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions, our scope 3 emissions actually increased year over year. And this is largely due to a substantial part of significant global data center expansions, and also the growth of Xbox sales and usage as a result of the pandemic. So following on from what Emmanuel was saying, so while we can reduce, it's really a global issue. So if we advance but others don't advance, then or these accounting of scope 3, this is really an issue for us. We've had lots of success reducing the carbon footprint of our products. Surface Pro 8 is one of the most energy efficient Surface Pros ever. We've introduced a new energy saver, a new lower power standby mode for Xbox consoles. We are doing a variety of things of increasing carbon awareness, and lowering carbon in cloud operations is really important for us. So we're piloting new approaches that lower carbon footprint of our code, as well as large scale workloads for Microsoft and our customers' benefits. But I think, and two final points on this, what we've discovered is that our progress won't be linear. So, our progress relies on counting all of the carbon, so all of the scopes, and where are the boundaries within this. So we are really all interconnected, and climate change is incredibly complex, and looking at ways to green the software is something that, the whole ethos of what we're about. And this last point of bringing people along, as a corporate point of view, in October 2021, we launched a Sustainability in Action badge. And this is the first all-employee learning course focused on sustainability, with 4 hours of content on carbon, water, waste, and ecosystems. Within the first 2 months, more than 3,000 employees completed the course and can serve as sustainability advocates. I think, finalizing on what Emmanuel was saying with regards to, we need to train people in ways that they're already very pivoted on or focused on, but we need to expand this knowledge of sustainability and climate and embed that into our decision making. So we're on a journey. We're making some progress, but we're also aware that we've still got a long way to go.
Thank you very much, and we can see similarities, and the notion of training and embarking, not only training, but really embarking the heart and the mind of everyone in the same direction. That's key. Florian, in the study, I think you've also made recommendations. So kind of, according to you and this idea to leverage technology also towards sustainability goals, what are the main success factors you can think of?
Yeah, maybe first, of course, it's more a study at macro level. And the big challenge is to have an increased adoption of the identified digital technologies to reduce carbon emissions. And we see, for example, the digital twin in the manufacturing sector. We have today an adoption rate of about 2% in Belgium, which is very low. And we should aim at least 60% in 2030. So therefore, we also conducted those interviews, 20 interviews. And based on that, the objective of the study was also to see which were the blocking or success factors for the adoption of the technologies. But first, I think based on the interviews, the main drivers definitely to adopt those technologies was return on investment, because thanks to those technologies, they could reduce their energy consumption. And with the high price of energy, it's definitely an argument. A second argument is the carbon reduction, but which is quite new, because I think 10 years ago, it was definitely not the main argument. But with the Green Deal policy, Fit for 55 and so on, we really see that for companies, it's very important to have suppliers having a sustainability strategy. And therefore, it becomes a competitive advantage to have yourself a sustainability strategy. So that's for the main drivers. Now, more in detail, for the success factors for this adoption. The first one, and I think Emmanuel mentioned it as well, is know-how and capabilities. We need, first, people have to be aware of the potential of digital technologies, aware of what is possible for climate change. We need the skills to do it, because, I mean, in Belgium and Europe in general, I think there is a lack of skills, digital skills, but combined with green skills. Second success factor is tech availability and standardization. Many companies said, look, we have sometimes technologies, but are not compatible with other technologies. So we also have to find solutions for those technologies. Third is economic viability. Just I talked about it, is a return on investment. And the last one, and was I think also mentioned by Margaret and Emmanuel, is environment for change. Of course, we can do something, but it's very important to have policy measures, to have other stakeholders involved, to have other companies also requiring a sustainability strategy from others to be able to really have an impact.
Great, and I want to double click because the three of you, you mentioned the importance of one, being aware of what is at stake, and second, developing the right skills to be able to embed sustainability inside the digital services, and to make sure that we make the best use of those, for example, the digital twin, towards to support the sustainability transformation. At Accenture, we've also developed some training programs for the awareness level. We invented the sustainability quotient. So you think about the intellectual quotient or the emotional quotient. Now we have the sustainability quotient. And we also have some more green software specific trainings. But I have to say that I'm kind of not patient person, kind of person, and I can see that the adoption rates, because you were mentioning adoption rates, are also not as perfect as that. It's growing year after year, but it's clearly not yet 100%. Why? Is first because people are busy, so they are, when you have the habit of delivering and the pressure to deliver, and also trainings to be done on new solutions, on new technologies, and so on, this comes on top. And second, because basically the why we are doing that, what is sustainability, the climate change, we hear in the newspapers every day about it, but not many of us are able to clearly make the connection between the causes and the consequences, and see a direct connection with our role professionally and personally. For all these reasons, we can see that this is the intake, the ramp up of skills and awareness is pretty, I find it, maybe it's because I'm not patient enough, I find it a bit slow. So I want to, have a discussion with you on, are you, seeing the same thing in your organization or your clients or other organization you talk to, and what do you think are ways to overcome and accelerate on this? Emmanuel, maybe starting with you.
First, I'm not patient too, so I totally understand your position. And clearly, yes, we are working a lot on performing awareness. When I took my position in January 2019, I have never thought that I would pass so much time on awareness. And clearly, communication is a large part of my job today. Sometimes I would like to pass much time on technical issues and on communication, but it is part of the job. And I will just mention that, yes, you're right. We are, in fact, in a cognitive dissonance between the climate emergency, the adoption rate, and the efficiency of awareness. I would just say there are three levels: awareness, training, and competencies. So awareness is really to be aware that there is an issue. Training, we know where is the issue and what are the ways to act. And competencies, we are able to apply the level of knowledge we have in our everyday life, both professional and personal one. Clearly, the ambition is to go very fast on the competencies level. So that's the ambition inside Airbus. So we have performed, by example, life cycle assessment trainings, and we have applied this to internal digital services, the high performance computing, that is the scientific computing. We have a data lake also with a tool to perform predictive maintenance. We have quantified this. So each time we are doing training to apply it immediately to the everyday life. That's maybe the first mean that I would see. And after, there are also means to benchmark, to say, well, we are progressing on that, but what is done in the other companies on this topic, etc. But I would say that we have to be cautious also. We have to be patient. In fact, I'm not. I know you are not, but we have to be. Because clearly we are at risk. We are at risk on the psychologic spirit to enter in a climate burnout on this kind of topic. And I would say that if we want to work on sustainability, the first thing to make sustainable is the team that is working on that. So we have to be cautious also with our employees who are really engaged on that, because if we discourage the people who are engaged, at the end, I'm not sure that it will be efficient.
That's a very good point. Yeah, climate burnout. I will try to avoid that for my team. Margaret, maybe or Florian. Go ahead, Florian, if you want to
Yeah. So about awareness and skills, definitely for Agoria, awareness is a big focus, a key point. And for example, for the study Digital for Climate, we really have a dissemination plan, to create awareness, but for politicians also, public actors, but also for companies, for the different stakeholders, and we are really working hard for this. So that's the first point. But I mean, awareness, Digital for Climate is one thing, but we also have other projects, for digital and green. And for the skills, we have a program which is called Be the Change, and it's also to anticipate the new skills which will be necessary for the future, among others, digital and green, but also other skills. So I think for us it's very important. So dissemination. And second point is we would like to put in place a program which is called Digital for Climate Innovation Program, to help companies adopting those technologies to reduce the carbon footprint. And therefore we are working, we would like to put this program into place with the regions in Belgium, but also to integrate this aspect in the current innovation programs in order, to make it concrete.
Yeah, mixing sustainability and innovation. Margaret, what about you? Awareness, skills, and innovation.
Yeah, so this innovation and awareness they were talking about, but for awareness, you need data. And so I can say this at Microsoft, we've, worked with lots of different businesses, and we can help businesses measure, monitor, and manage their data. That's really what we do. And we've discovered that for organizations of all kind and in every industry, this overarching sustainability journey is similar. It's been our own experience, and we see it with others that we work with too. The journey begins with understanding where you are today, setting these future goals, and then making data-driven decisions about the best steps to achieve those goals. But this accurate, reliable data intelligence is critical for the success of these initiatives. And for an organization to truly make progress towards accelerating their sustainability progress and business growth, they need better visibility and transparency into the environmental footprint of their entire operations, their products, the activities of their people, and their value chain. And so one of the things that we just released, that's why the first dedicated sustainability solution we've sent to the market as part of the Cloud for Sustainability is this Microsoft Sustainability Manager, which came into general application in the 1st of June of this month. And what it does is it unifies data intelligence to help organizations monitor and manage their sustainability performance. What's interesting is that it's an extensible solution that enables organizations to more easily record, report, and reduce their environmental impact through increasing the automated data connections that deliver actionable insights. The solution gives organizations visibility really into their actual environmental footprint of their operations. As I said, currently we find that a lot of companies, they track this on, spreadsheets or it's data in different pockets. We provide a solution that allows that to pull together, and it provides the foundational intelligence business leaders need to continually guide, refine, and scale sustainability initiatives. And one last point on this is that we're prioritizing the planet's most urgent needs. And what Microsoft Sustainability Manager initially supports is emissions-focused initiatives to help organizations on a path to net zero. But in the future, we're actually working on expanding this to support water and waste initiatives too, to help organizations on their way to becoming water positive and zero waste. So really, and final point is this Microsoft Sustainability Manager is built on the Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability data model, which streamlines this data ingestion, sharing calculations and reporting. It's really designed to break down the data silos across emission sources and centralizing emissions data in a common format. Organizations can then share this publicly available data model with their teams, their vendors and trading partners to drive data integrity and consistent reporting both upstream and downstream. So we're working hard at that. I'm super excited about this and looking forward to working with several of our partners and clients on this.
Yeah, and I can recognize that. That's great, because I can recognize that yeah, visibility of the right data brings is the mother of everything, and you cannot, if you don't have that, you cannot have awareness, you cannot have training. Absolutely. And we can see that, you know, the IPCC scientists, they are saying we've been producing the data for the last 30 years, but actually they are not visible enough to everyone in the right format that is easy to capture, easy to understand, so that you know, everyone actually understand, is aware of what is at stake for humanity and what in what time frame. So that's why at Accenture we've selected, there is a tool called Climate Fresk that is for an example of, you know, what you can, how you can make some data visible in an interactive and fun workshop. But obviously, what Margaret you are mentioning is it's much broader, and, you know, for at the enterprise level, and giving visibility to the right data is absolutely key. That's a great point. Last, I'd like, and I mean, please, everyone, in the chat, you can also put some questions, but I have another one on my side. You mentioned in terms of success factor, two things. You mentioned awareness, training, skills, so we've covered that. You also mentioned the importance of working as an ecosystem. So I'd like to come back to that and maybe double click on this as well, and have examples or, you know, obstacles you're seeing, also success factors you're seeing with your suppliers, with your clients, with partners from various groups. You know, what do you see powerful? What would you like to accelerate and to develop? Maybe a broad question, but Emmanuel, if you can help us with that.
Yes, I can. I totally join your point of view. That is that we have to work as an ecosystem. So it's not a company progressing alone on its own. It's really an ecosystem, and I would say that it is also a question to what we call carbon neutrality. And we have the French Agency for Environment that has defined that carbon neutrality can't be defined at the level of a company. It can be defined at the level of a country, probably because it is in line with the Paris Agreement. But there is not a company alone that can be carbon neutral on its own. It's an ecosystem, and if we are alone to be carbon neutral, that all other companies are not, we are not more advanced. So in line with that, inside Airbus, we have launched what we call a RFI, a request for information. The initial idea was to say we are going to introduce sustainable IT requirements in our call for tender. But are we sure that our suppliers are going to be mature enough to answer? So we have said we are going to inform them of the next requirements that are coming. And we say, well, okay, we are going to send an information, but are we sure that they will collect this information and be up to the challenge? So we are going to ask them. And we say, yes, we are going to receive commercial yes with these requirements, and we are not doing to be more advanced on that because it will be only commercial. So the idea was to change the point of view and to say we are going to ask open questions. So what do you do on e-wastes? And I know that, Carol, you know it because Accenture is part of this RFI, and Microsoft is also a part of this request for information. And I would not say too much on that because clearly we are running in the second wave of this RFI, where we have introduced also the societal criteria relative to critical raw material, by example, relative to conflict minerals, to human rights respect. So it's a way to influence our value chain, our ecosystem, and to progress together. And clearly also to contribute to external work groups inside institutes, inside associations, and different kind of unions is a way to share the best practices and to progress together.
And I confirm it works because, of course, yeah, we are willing to, do our best in meeting and exceeding Airbus expectations as many of our clients. So it definitely works. Florian, you are at the heart of an ecosystem because you are, at a business federation. Do you see members of your federation come together on this topic of sustainability and technology? Do you have examples of things happening between companies?
It's definitely starting, but not all companies. I think like most of all big companies are trying, to reduce the carbon footprint, for example, working together with other companies, working together with a university or with Agoria. But for smaller ones, I think it's not obvious yet. So we have to work on that. And in an ecosystem, because I see also more and more members are developing new solutions, to reduce carbon emissions. So it's more generally speaking about Agoria, because indeed we are in a very important network of ecosystem of actors, innovation center companies. We also have a lot of contact with policymakers, of course. And therefore, again, in our study, Digital for Climate, we made recommendation for the policymakers. And for example, for skills, for investment in those technologies, for legislation, for the Digital for Climate Innovation Program. We also have recommendations for companies with a plan in 3 steps, to implement those technologies. And we also have recommendations for citizens on a more general basis. And the aim of this study is also to put people together and to build this ecosystem.
Great. So I think I will try to paste the link to the study also in the chat, if not already done, because I think it's a very interesting one, and communication on that can help the ecosystem as a whole move in Belgium for sure and beyond. Margaret, you mentioned that on Microsoft's side, the Scope 3 is a key topic for the company, and of course, working on the Scope 3 means working with the whole ecosystem and your suppliers. Can you elaborate a bit on that, on what's happening? What are the some, what you see is going well or, more difficult?
Yeah, no, so that's a really good point, because as I mentioned before, even though we are hitting our, Scope 1 and Scope 2 goals, our Scope 3 increased via the use of our products. And so we obviously didn't know this fact, but in July 2020, we were anticipating, and we realized we work with a lot of partners, so many, and Accenture obviously being one, the Green Software Foundation, several. And what we wanted to do, or we thought about, was how do we influence then? So how do we influence, and not just what we're doing, but influence the market into more sustainable software as well as products and services. So we added additional sustainability requirements to our supplier code of conduct in July 2020 to support our company's bold carbon ambitions, which were announced in January of 2020. And in July 2021, what we found was that 87% of Microsoft's in-scope suppliers reported their emissions to CDP, because that was one of the requirements requested, and that was up 12% from 2020. So following the closure of the CDP cycle, we then worked with the suppliers to build action plans of emissions reductions activities leading up to 2030. Because by 2030, we've got this goal of reducing our carbon emissions on our scope 3 by 50%. So this is a big ambitious goal, and we're working on this. So this included educational webinars and one-to-one meeting with suppliers to dive into their individual footprints and discuss relevant reduction levers. Microsoft, we've also provided suppliers with resources to aid in their reduction efforts, because we continue to believe that for Microsoft to reach our reduction goals, collaboration with suppliers is fundamental, and we really look forward to continuing the journey together. So that's just a short example of what we're doing, but we're very much aware of it. And scope 3 is not Emmanuel's reference to Mount Everest. It does kind of feel like it's a huge task of how we, but collectively we all need to come together to solve that.
Great example. I have to ask, can you tell us more about what sustainability industry advocate is?
Okay, so that's a great question as well. So I feel super privileged because I get to work with some of Microsoft's largest customers, and looking at ways in which we embed sustainability across, as a strategy, working with them in products and services, solutions. The Microsoft Sustainability Manager is one of those. So what's really great is, so I work on strategy, but I love the customer focusing aspect, and then that builds also the knowledge as to how can we best enable a digital or technology transformation, but taking into account, my background is in climate and finance, and taking into account all of these, along with the really, big brains that we have, I would say, with regards to, I'm not a technology specialist, but I am a climate sustainability carbon specialist. And so putting these together, I get to work with some amazing people. So I feel super lucky to be able to be a sustainability industry advocate at Microsoft.
Lovely. So that's the end of this session. I want to really thank you a lot. Thank you. Say a great thank you to all of you, because this has been very, very inspiring. I think we can feel the passion and the your commitment to a very concrete impact. Definitely the elements you mentioned about awareness, training, working as an ecosystem, that's also something that is the target of the Green Software Foundation. So that's a great segue to the rest of the session of this European Summit. I have to say I'm very proud also to see that we're able to gather people from various countries in Europe, and I think Europe is kind of leading the way, and we can feel it with the European Green Digital Coalition. So I'm happy to be European when I see that. Anyway, so thank you so much, and I hope this has been inspiring for the group as well. And Chris, maybe you can tell us how to join the rest of the sessions.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would say I'm very proud to be European as well, at the politics aside. So thank you very much again to Carol, Emmanuel, Margaret, and Florian for that amazing panel session. The business track will continue in this particular call. The next session will be everything you wanted to know about the Green Software Foundation. So going into a little bit more detail with myself and Naveen. And if you wanted to swap tracks, then the other track is going to be on green design, which is the fact that green software isn't just for developers. So how can designers and others get involved? So feel free to swap or stay here. And that said, I thank our panelists again, and we'll move on to the next session. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
And welcome, Naveen.
Okay. Right, I'm just going to bring Naveen up on stage. So yeah, this next session is going to be everything that you wanted to know about the Green Software Foundation. So we'll start with an introduction from Naveen. Naveen, do you just want to introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. Hi, everyone. First of all, a very warm welcome to Green Software Foundation Summit. Very excited to be here. I'm Naveen Balani. I'm a Chief Technologist with Technology Sustainability Innovation Group at Accenture. working on various innovations and strategy for technology sustainability. And I've been an active contributor to Green Software Foundation and also chair of a couple of open source projects. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. So yep, I introduced myself at the start. So I lead open technology and green software at Avanade. And I'll start off by explaining a little bit about green software before we go into a little bit more from Naveen about how we can actually tackle this. So initially, in a report in 2017, a report from Greenpeace reckoned that the total impact of technology was about 12% of global emissions. And effectively, we may not realize it, but carbon is emitted from everything that we use and interact with near enough in our day-to-day life, either because carbon was part of creating the product, or carbon is part of recycling the product, or finally, carbon could actually be emitted through the use of electricity day-to-day. So every industry has carbon emissions that actually need to be reduced for one reason or another. And I think when we think about sustainability, I don't know about you, but I used to think about the cups I might need to recycle, single-use plastics. I would think about maybe turning on a fan, for example. But I never thought about the fact that I might be sat on Teams or Slack or Skype and interacting with software which ultimately has to use energy which has been made in some way. So the technology industry's carbon come from a number of different factors, but the next decade of software is going to be more influenced by climate change than almost any other factor. In 2020, the major cloud providers made a commitment to reduce carbon by 2030. So incredible. By 2030, all of these clouds are going to be green. We're all just going to move to the cloud and tech is suddenly carbon zero, problem solved. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The majority of carbon comes from software that's actually in use. When you're running something in Azure, Amazon, or Google, that is consuming electricity, and that electricity had to be created somehow. And in many different countries, the electricity is created from fossil fuels or non-renewables. And in those countries which are lucky enough to have relatively green sources, they're running on hardware that had to be manufactured using carbon, that embodies carbon, and ultimately that carbon has to be removed and cleaned. So more efficient software means less waste, whether or not that is waste carbon from the use of software, or whether or not that is waste carbon from making our software more efficient to extend the lifespan of servers so they don't have to be recycled as soon. And that still applies in countries like France, where luckily enough, the energy grid is incredibly green. So more efficient software plays a big role in fostering more sustainable operations. Now, a nice statistic that I bandy around absolutely everywhere is that greening one software department is like we're taking 26,000 fossil-fueled cars off the road. And to take that example even further, that's like filling 44 stadiums full of cars. That's a lot of cars. That's a lot of carbon, and that's from one business department. I don't think people tend to think of that. And there's an incredible study in the chat which can talk about this impact. So data centers currently account for the equivalent of the world's entire airline industry, as Carol explained in the opener, and that number is only going up. So whilst we should maybe consider shifting to the cloud with all the security and data sovereignty concerns we need to consider, we also, as developers, designers, business leaders, have an obligation to make our software greener. Software runs on devices that is in people's possessions. So your phone, for example, runs software. Many light switches, LEDs, actually still use a tiny bit of software to actually provide the right amount of power to the metal filaments. And servers need electricity, and that has been fossil fueled, as I mentioned. So the tech industry and nearly every business uses tech. Again, Teams, Slack, Zoom, WebEx, whatever you use. We have software that we use, so we are tech consumers and users. We either need to use much less electricity or use that clean electricity, or you also have to use those fewer devices. So repair them, keep them with software and security patches, make them last longer, rehabilitate them. Honestly, I don't think people realize the scale of the challenge. We're also focused on e-waste, waste streams, and recycling. And the problem with phones is we're incentivized to upgrade them over time. We don't replace parts. We don't upgrade them in part. Devices like smartphones and tablets they cause CO2 emissions during manufacture. We trap carbon in those devices and in the casing. And these can actually be orders of magnitude higher than the emissions from the device being used or that are being charged. So using smartphones and upgrading phones way too early, but we need to, actually has a massive impact. If you look here, we can see the direct effects of CO2 emissions per end user device. And you can see that actually TVs are, yeah, they have their own problems, but you can see that nearly every single device that we use, from desktop computers, tablets, and laptops, the majority of the emissions are from production. So we need to use fewer devices per person throughout our own lives. We need to use the devices that we have for longer. And ultimately, that also means that people that are making these devices need to make that possible for you. So going back to carbon commitments, I mentioned that Google, Azure, AWS are all trying to get to net zero by 2030. Well, actually, if you can't measure things, you can't improve them. That a common management adage. So there are many different paths to net zero. So we can either reduce our emissions by 50%, or we can neutralize our emissions by 50%. Actually, these things are often conflated together, but they are not the same thing. We are not talking about offsets and neutralizations, because the carbon offset is actually just shifting your problem onto someone else. It's someone planting a tree. It's someone reducing someone else's consumption. It's not actually stopping the amount of carbon going out into the world. Carbon offsets aren't permanent. Emissions hang around for absolutely ages unless we use technology solutions to actively remove them from the air, which again, use energy. So we're looking to eliminate, stop, reduce our emissions, and we need to get to a 45% reduction of our emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050 if we want a planet that we can physically live on. Beyond profit, beyond anything else, we want to live on a planet where we don't have to, I don't know, wear refrigeration suits, wear masks. I don't want to scare people, but there's a lot that we can all do, and we're in a good place to do it. There's a very positive message that we are not past the tipping point. So if you're in private cloud, most of your emissions are in scope 2 of the greenhouse gas protocol, from energy and your embodied carbon. When you move to the public cloud or a hybrid cloud, actually a lot of those emissions come partly out of your control, but they drop off a lot of the accountancy and reporting that your companies do. So that's why this might seem a little bit vague and high level, but actually we need to know where our emissions are, because if it drops off your accountancy reporting, you tend to think, okay, not my problem, nothing I need to deal with anymore. So we need our teams to write software that is more efficient, or for that software to only run when green electricity is available. We need to make 100% usage of our servers rather than using a lot of different servers partly. And we need to work with our data center and cloud providers to have our machines run on green electricity as much as possible. Realize I'm talking about a mile a minute here. So we also then need to think about how we reduce our emissions. So I talked about offsets, but actually I've already explained that compensation and avoidance, that's all offsets are really. It's paying someone else not to emit carbon or to do things better. We need to actually look at how we can take carbon out of the atmosphere. And the best thing is that we don't actually emit that carbon in the first place. You don't have to remove what you don't contribute. So there are many things that every single person on this call is responsible for, is part of, and has an impact that can be made. For most people, we live on an interconnected grid. There are many producers pumping electricity in and many consumers and people taking electricity out. So being part of this energy grid means you're part of one massive hyper-connected machine. And it means that the electrons coming into your device are a mixture of all the electrons going into the grid. So if your energy grid in your country is only powered 5% by wind at the moment, you are getting 5% of wind generated electrons and maybe 95% of your fossil fuel generated electrons. So actually, it's really hard to identify if your grid is being 100% matched by renewables. A lot of the energy providers that might say they are, and that say they are using renewables, what they're really doing is say they're pumping in a certain amount of kilowatt hours into the grid. They're going, okay, that kilowatt hours, that 20, that 30, that's green. Actually, it's all just being mixed in. So really, again, it's up to each of us to consider how we can reduce the carbon from our software and from our development teams. When it comes to 100% renewable claims in our companies, there's a lot of questions around the granularity of matching. Do we look up and add the total of yearly, monthly, weekly, daily hours of the energy that's going in? Is your company using renewable electricity every day, every year, every month, every hour? If your company consumes energy mostly during the day and renewable energy is mostly generated at night, it might net off every day to zero in your company's accounting, but that's not really helping the world transition towards a lower carbon future. So we need 100% of the power, 100% of the time coming from low carbon sources. That means we need our accounting to match when we're actually using our energy. It means we need our teams to actually be cognizant of what is going on. And it means, again, our teams need to be working with their developers, their business analysts, their finance teams, their procurement teams, the people on the front line taking telephone calls and call centers or working in shops to have the tools to be green. I've been working with a UK body that does a lot of apprenticeships training in the UK, and they're now producing training courses for how nurses that go into houses can be greener. For example, when they go into a care home and they boil a kettle, actually they just use the amount of water that they need to use electricity, which for one person makes very little difference. But for every nurse is using less electricity, that makes a massive difference. And they're doing that industry by industry. So that message isn't just for us. It's not just techies. Your companies have to fix things. Every person in every industry will have a change to make, from nursing to farming to land use to retail. But these talks are targeted at us and our culture and what we can do. We can't just buy offsets. There aren't enough of them. They don't store carbon for long enough. They don't just stop the energy magically going into the atmosphere. 1 ton of carbon emitted will warm the earth for billions of years from today. 1 ton of carbon offset by planting a tree will be sucked out of the atmosphere over 40 years. If that tree dies, or if that tree gets too hot, if that tree catches fire, that carbon is released back into the atmosphere. We will always need offsets in some way, but we shouldn't just assume that's the answer. Software can generally be offset. There's generally things that we can do. There are no quick fixes, but there's a lot of change that our organizations can do. So that kind of banging the drum about what we need to do was the start of this talk. I'm now going to hand over to Naveen to talk a little bit more about what green software is and actually the positives about what you can do. And Ellen, I'd love to talk to you about that and how Avanade and Accenture can help and how you can join the Green Software Foundation to do the same if you're not already part of it.
So thanks, Chris. So to summarize, what we have been talking about is technology itself has a carbon footprint. And the way we design, develop, deploy applications, be it cloud or on-premises, needs to include sustainability as one of the key outcomes. And the focus should be on creating energy efficient applications. And that's where the Green Software Foundation comes in, which is all about designing, developing, and deploying applications which emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea is to include sustainability as a first-class citizen, similar to security or performance of any application. And sustainability matters because beyond the great promise of protecting people and our planet, our Accenture research, which was released last week, shows that companies with a higher level of sustainability performance across environmental, social, and governance indicators outperform their peers financially. And when we talk about green software, we are looking at the space holistically and identified energy reduction opportunities. And at Accenture, we have created a methodology and have broken down into 7 material impact areas. Moving on to the next slide. So it all starts with green software development lifecycle on what kind of software development lifecycle practices you are following, specifically for green software development. For instance, the choice of architecture decisions you are making, the choice of programming languages, whether you're creating optimized code, how are you measuring the carbon footprint of the application as part of your DevOps process? For instance, just to give you an example, Python and JavaScript are widely used language, but they take 48 times more energy than semi-compiled language. When it comes to cloud, like what kind of cloud architectures you are using, like serverless versus always on virtual machines, use of managed services, and so on. And I just read a recent blog which talked about sidecar container implementation being moved from JavaScript to Rust, which is the second best energy efficient language, which offered 75% reduction in CPU usage and a 95% reduction in memory usage, leading to energy efficient application. And moreover, it's just not migrating to energy efficient language. You also need to evaluate the trade-offs as part of the green software development. For instance, you'll just not move from Python to C for your AI or machine learning development because maybe the required libraries or the skill set is not available, but you rather focus on optimizing your ML models and ML process to start with. Next is the green UI UX experience, which looks at how do you build energy efficient UI applications, be it web, mobile, augmented reality, virtual reality, or in future metaverse. For instance, it could be about how can you create energy efficient 3D models, virtual worlds, choice of color palettes, dark themes, and optimizing images, and so on. With respect to green AI, in order to build AI applications, you typically follow an end-to-end process uh, that comprises of data acquisition, data cleansing, building out data pipelines, training iteratively, and doing test and deployment. And in each step, you need to make certain decisions with respect to energy efficiency. For instance, how can I create sustainable data pipeline? What ML framework should I use? Trade-offs between accuracy and energy consumptions, using approaches like transfer learning and the overall MLOps process. For instance, our experiment with a relatively small AI model, we found that getting an additional accuracy of 2% from baseline led to 700% jump in energy consumption. So you need to be aware of when to stop training and understand the trade-off with respect to your application. And if you look at some of the models like BERT and GPT-3, they are quite energy hungry. So model selection also becomes an important factor. For example, you could use Distill BERT, which is a distilled version of the popular NLP model BERT, which has 40% fewer parameters, runs 60% faster, while preserving 97% of the BERT functionality. So understanding the design principles and trade-offs becomes important. Next area is distributed ledger technology or blockchain, on how can you design and develop energy efficient blockchain application. Maybe it's the right set of consensus algorithm, a design of distributed and decentralized network, storage, smart contract implementation, and so on. And especially with the talk around digital currency being created and non-fungible tokens, this becomes very important area for us to keep a tab in future. For instance, how can you do lazy minting of non-fungible tokens without procuring any gas fees and hence lowering the environmental impact? Now, when it comes to data, data is one of the key assets for any organizations. And we have seen it has been accumulated over the years by enterprises with a view that it might be used in future. And personally also is true for, I think, every one of us, whether it's our Gmail account and photo accounts, we keep on adding photos and we never bother to go back and delete it, right? It just keeps on accumulating. Similarly, if you extrapolate this problem for enterprises, data that is lying somewhere in the enterprise or never used constitute to around 70 to 90% as per a research. So data relevancy, identifying and purging duplicate data, choice of data storage, architectures, data types, formats, data retention timeline, all needs to be looked at holistically as storage, backups, transfer of data all constitute towards a significant carbon emission. The Green Cloud Edge data center effort is all about migrating to public clouds and leverage inherent sustainability levers offered by various cloud providers. And once you are running on the cloud, then you go about applying green cloud principles, like what it takes to create a sustainable cloud application. For instance, there are hundreds of services being offered by the cloud vendor, like which works best from a sustainability point of view, and taking in account the green cloud region. For instance, migrating from Asia East region to a cleaner region can save you 66% emissions. And finally, we have the infrastructure, be it laptops, desktops, mobile phones, servers, which Chris also pointed out, and the underlying infrastructure, which drives all the execution of softwares. And how can you reduce embodied carbon, increase the lifespan of devices, and reduce life cycle emissions associated with the manufacturing process itself and end of life of devices. And all this information which I talked about is covered in a sustainability technology sustainability report, which was released last week. So please feel to go ahead and download and read it. Moving on to the next slide. So in order to advance green software development, can you move to the next slide, Chris? Yeah. So in order to advance green software development, so we need to look at this at scale, particularly because green software is a very emerging area. So we need to apply collective thinking, create new specifications, and drive innovations. Look at how we can increase awareness, talent, training, and that's why the Green Software Foundation was created. And last year, Accenture, Microsoft, GitHub, ThoughtWorks all came together to form the Green Software Foundation, which is a foundation of Linux Foundation. And now it has grown to 30 plus organizations operating over 190 countries, including representations from nonprofits and universities also. Moving on to the next slide. So as part of the foundation, just to a deep dive, we focus on 4 key work groups. Standard work groups is focused on creating specifications and standards for green software. And I'll talk about software carbon intensity specification and how we can apply SCI to a real world application in the next few slides. The open source working group is creating and driving innovations through open source projects. For instance, whether it's SCI open data, looking at what data is required for carbon emission calculation and making it available to public. The Awesome Green Software project is all about providing resources to get started with green software development. Carbon Aware SDK is another project which provides APIs on when and where to run the application based on clean energy. And all these projects and many more in future, you'll see a lot of innovation happening. All are trying to fill the gaps required to measure and realize green software application. The community working group is looking at community building projects, blogs, certifications. They're coming up with a new the first ever green software certification and this inaugural Green Software Foundation event. And policy working group basically looks at how we can engage with other projects, governments or non-government organizations and other policymakers. Moving on to the next slide, I'll talk about software carbon intensity specification, which is the first industry-led consensus-based specification that can be applied to any software to measure and reduce its carbon emission. And one of the questions we keep getting asked is, why do you need SCI? Why is SCI different from other specifications? Now, SCI is different because it's more action-oriented. It looks at reduction. We talk about reduction and not offsets. And the score, the SCI score that gets created, right, can be reduced by only 3 key factors. First, either you create energy efficient application. Second, you use less hardware for same amount of work. And third being carbon aware, like using intelligent carbon scheduling and running your workloads whenever there is a clean energy. the specs basically follows an iterative process. Like last year, we released an alpha version in December. We are getting feedbacks, trying to incorporate it, and are working towards the next release and trying to build up case studies that will be helpful for public in general. And from a methodology perspective, from an SCI, you basically start off with defining the software boundary. Like what do you want to measure? Whether it's a backend application, it's a front-end application, or it's a full stack that you like to measure. Next, you define how your application scales. For instance, for a credit card company, it may be transactions per second. It may be APIs. For B2B app, it may be users, and so on. Once you have defined the function unit, you go about measurement, like whether it's lab-based measurement, stress testing, load testing, or you use real-world measurements. And then you calculate the SCI score for each of the component, and then you basically sum it up. So if you look at the SCI equation, it's basically energy, which is consumed by the underlying hardware running the software, multiplied by the intensity, which represents the marginal carbon intensity at that particular interval, plus the embodied emissions, and dividing it by the function unit. So let's look at how we can apply SCI to a real-world application. So let's take an example of fintech application providing ESG stock recommendation. So it has a data capture component, which gets the market data from various sources, which is processed by the data processing environment, which is acted by ML models that run on analytic environment to generate insights. And finally, the insights are delivered via APIs to web or a mobile application. Now, if you want to calculate the SCI for this application, the first step is to define the software boundary. In this case, the technology stack that is being displayed is our software boundary. Next, we determine the function unit. Since it's a B2B application, we define function unit as number of users. Third, we calculate the SCI for each component. And each component would have a dependency on other components. For instance, analytics environment has a dependency on data processing environment, and so on. And finally, you have add the SCI score for all the components to give you carbon equivalent per user. So moving on to the next slide. So this slide highlights one of the open source project that we are currently driving as part of the innovation or the open source working group. And this project is called SCI Open Ontology. And if you look at the SCI specification, the first step is to basically create the software boundary. And through this project, we plan to create a unified ontology model that can be used by any organization to describe the software boundary and see how it is evolved over releases. So you can determine the changes that you are making, either has a positive impact or a negative impact. For instance, if you move from a language like PHP to Rust, let's say for microservice development, you would represent this as part of the software language construct that you see on the right-hand side. And when you compare the SCI score across these two versions, you can easily find out what change caused the impact by comparing the models. Similarly, if you're using more hardware, let's say in a particular version of a software, and you decide to cut it down and use some kind of hardware optimization, and the same code is running with less hardware, in the ontology itself, you will have multiple versions of hardware representation. And when you compare two versions, you can easily find out why the hardware reduction basically caused a positive impact to your SCI score. Similarly, if you look at the operation emissions, and if you decide to move your, let's say, a machine learning job, let's say from an Asia East region, which I talked about earlier, to a more cleaner region, you would have this laid down in the ontology model along with all the measurements, and then you can easily determine between two versions what caused the change. So all the three action items which I talked about in SCI, right, how you go about reducing it, can be captured through this ontology model. And this is helpful because in future, we may be able to compare two SCI-enabled applications using the ontology model if all organizations start to represent in the same unified model. And that's why the unified model becomes important. So with this, I like to end my talk. Hope this gives some perspective on this important topic, and we can all start embedding green software practices. And as collectively as software practitioners, we can help reduce our software carbon impact for a greener planet. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Naveen. So before we move on to our next session, which is a workshop, I just want to ask if there are any questions for Naveen and myself about the Green Software Foundation or about sustainability in general. And then after that, I'll be turning off the recording before the workshop starts. Okay, feel free to ask any questions as we go. I'm now going to stop the recording because we're going to move into a workshop.